Hi, welcome. I'm Suzanne Spalding. I am Senior Advisor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, where I lead the Defending Democratic Institutions Project. Over the past year, I had the honor of serving on the Cyberspace Solarium Commission, and today we are going to be talking about that report, its recommendations, and its relevance to our current pandemic. We had hoped to be bringing you this program from Austin, Texas. We were scheduled to be part of the South by Southwest event, which sadly had to be canceled this year. I thought about piping in music to start us off here today. We weren't quite able to make that happen, but there's a wonderful Austin band called Asleep at the Wheel. And their drummer, for those of you who are fans, you may know this, their drummer's name is David Sanger. And we are privileged to have with us today David Sanger. David Sanger, who is the chief correspondent and senior writer, journalist with the New York Times. He has, in his 36 years of writing for the New York Times, won numerous awards, including 3 Pulitzer Prizes for teams on which he's played a key role. He has lots of accomplishments. He's written a number of books, the most recent of which is The Perfect Weapon, War, Sabotage, and Fear in the Cyber Age, which I highly recommend. He is a 1982 graduate of Harvard College and currently co-teaches with Graham Allison a course entitled Central Challenges in American National Security, Strategy, and the Press at the Kennedy School of Government. Our David Sanger does not, as far as I know, play the drums. We are also privileged to be joined today by my esteemed colleague on the Cyberspace Solarium Commission, Congressman Jim Langevin, Rhode Island. Congressman Langevin was elected to the House of Representatives in 2000. He's a senior member of the House Armed Services Committee, where he is the ranking member of the Emerging Threats and Capabilities Subcommittee. He's also a senior member of the House Homeland Security Committee. He has long been a leader on national security and particularly on securing our nation's infrastructure from cyber threats. He was a co-founder of the Congressional Cybersecurity Caucus, and I first worked with Congressman Langevin years ago on the Center for Strategic and International Studies Commission on Cybersecurity for the 44th President, which he co-chaired. He also co-chairs the bipartisan Congressional Career and Technical Education Caucus, where he is a strong advocate for increasing access to training and improving the skills of young people so that they can make the most of their talents, and particularly in areas where employers are looking for skills. Hence, he is a strong supporter of improving our cybersecurity training. He was elected to the Rhode Island House of Representatives in 1986, and in 1994, he became the youngest Secretary of State. Among his other accomplishments, his leadership resulted in reforms to Rhode Island's outdated election system. So another area of expertise on an issue very important to us today. We are really thrilled to have both of you here. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to David, who is our moderator.
Well, thank you, Suzanne, and thank you, Congressman Langevin, for joining us. And sorry we're not all doing this in Austin. When I first got the invitation to join you guys at South by Southwest, I called Suzanne and I said, clearly they have invited the wrong David Sanger. They meant the local one. But she insisted that while he was fabulous on the drums, that for an hour-long conversation on cyber, that no, they were going to actually go with the loser of the two. So, Congressman, let me start with you. For those who have joined us today and may not know much about the Cyber Solarium, how it was modeled on the Eisenhower Solarium project, which was part of developing our Cold War strategies, can you just tell us a little bit about what the commission was, and to the degree you can, just sort of touch on the main conclusions of what I have around as a probably 300-page printout of the final report?
Sure. Well, David, thank you. Great to be with you. Thanks for moderating today, and along with my colleague on the Cyberspace Solarium Commission, Suzanne Spalding. It's great to be with Suzanne again. We had indeed all hoped to be together in person at South by in Texas. It would have been a great opportunity to meet with many of the attendees there and speak about this in person. I had been trying to get the South by Southwest conference for years, and schedules just have not lined up because of congressional votes. And this was the one time that was going to work out, and I was so excited to go there. And as fate would have it, it just did not work out, just by a whisker, unfortunately. So I hope to be able to take a rain check and be able to be there at a future event. But being on the Solarium Commission and participating in the robust dialogue and discussion and debate that took place was so meaningful, among my most meaningful experiences in the 20 years that I've been in Congress. And quite frankly, it's the way that Congress should function very often, but unfortunately it doesn't. But we had that opportunity at the commission. And as you mentioned, it was designed on the premise of and built up the concept of the Eisenhower Project Solarium. When Stalin passed away, President Eisenhower recognized that our strategy in dealing with the Soviet Union was more geared toward dealing with the person than dealing with the country. And so he tasked his national security team to divide up into three groups, and they basically had to argue and develop positions around three strategies. One, which was confrontation; second was dismantlement; third was containment. And they argued their position before Eisenhower, and President Eisenhower being the final arbiter. Eventually, as history now knows, we chose containment, and it guided U.S. policy, our spending, our strategy going forward for several decades. Well, the Congress has recognized that the country, the United States, needs a much more comprehensive strategy for protecting the United States in cyberspace. We will never again see modern warfare, for example, without some type of a cyber component to it. We are the country that invented the internet. We make most use of it, but we're also most vulnerable to its flaws or security loopholes. And security was never the internet was never built with security in mind. And so we recognized, Congress recognized, in creating the Cyberspace Solarium Commission in the NDAA that we needed an overarching strategy. So basically, we came up with the three major concepts, if you will, that would shape behavior. And the second would be to deny benefits of our adversaries. And the third would be to impose costs on our adversaries. And basically, there were 6 pillars within this whole concept, this construct, these findings. First of which was to basically reforming the U.S. government structure and organization. So one of our key conclusions there was creating a national cyber director, a Senate-confirmed national cyber director that had both policy and budgetary authority. The next reform of the government structure would be creating a select committee on cybersecurity. Right now, there are some 80 different committees and subcommittees in Congress that can claim jurisdiction to cybersecurity in some way, shape, or form. It is beyond frustrating that when you want to introduce a bill or have a hearing, or you want to move a piece of legislation to the Congress, that it moves so slowly because of all these multiple jurisdiction claims. And so, and also the Congress really lacks right now the expertise, the cyber expertise. So by creating a select committee on cyber, you would have members that would develop cyber expertise, as well as staff that would further develop cyber expertise. And that would be the primary focus of cyber legislation and oversight. So you could better coordinate oversight of cybersecurity, but you'd be able to move with much greater agility and effectiveness if you had one focal point. In the same way that the Congress created the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence and the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. during intelligence reform back in the 70s. The second pillar is strengthen norms and non-military tools. So basically, that would be, for example, creating an assistant Secretary of State for cyber to lead a bureau of cyberspace security and emerging technologies. So this is working more with our international partners and working with establishing international norms of what is responsible and not responsible behavior in cyberspace, and being able to call out entities that violate those norms. The third pillar of the six is promote national resilience. So looking at the consequences of cyber incidents, and how do we lessen those consequences? If the bad thing happened, how do we reconstitute and get up and running more quickly? So thinking about it in terms of continuity of the economy planning. The fourth pillar, reshape the cyber ecosystem toward greater security. So looking at vulnerability of cyber incidents, and how do we quantify what gets us to stronger cyber security? And one of the things that is really a glaring omission, if you will, from the discussion, is being able to quantify what is better technology and more cybersecurity. So creating the idea of creating a Bureau of Cyber Statistics would be an example. So that if we employed a new cyber technology, let's say two-factor authentication, how much more cyber secure does that actually make an entity? Sometimes we have a gut feeling right now of what it makes us more cyber secure, but we don't really know. And this would help to develop those metrics. The fifth pillar is operationalize cybersecurity collaboration with the private sector, basically countering cyber threat actors, and also designating systemically important critical infrastructure. We call it SICI, systemically important critical infrastructure, to identify those entities that have a unique position in our country, that if they were attacked, if they went down, that not only would the business entity have a bad day, but the country would have a bad day. So developing a closer relationship with them, more collaboration, and trying to make them more resilient. And then finally, the sixth pillar is basically preserve and employ military instruments of power, and basically looking at strengthening and resourcing U.S. Cybercom in a posture review, making sure that we're updating the work that they're doing and make sure that they're properly resourced. But basically, you're looking at the balance of cyber protection teams, the national mission teams, and the combat mission teams correct. So that's just by way of example. So a broad overview, but that's the findings of the commission. There were some 75 or 80 recommendations in the Cyberspace Solarium Commission report, many of which are going to be accompanied by legislative proposals, and we're working to incorporate some of those, many of them hopefully within the National Defense Authorization Act, where I have the distinct privilege of chairing the Intelligence and Emerging Threats and Capabilities Subcommittee. And so where we can put these in my mark or in the full committee mark, we're going to do that. Other ways, we're looking to get sign off from other committees to allow us to offer an amendment for the NDAA to include more recommendations in there. But some of them are short, medium, and long-term goals, but they're all important. And I was so honored to work with such high caliber, quality people like Suzanne Spalding, who's an expert in cyber in her own right, and the other commissioners that were part of the effort. Again, the dialogue and discussion was rich, and debate was just excellent. The way that Congress really should function, and I was proud to be a part of the effort. And I believe that this is an actionable report. I give great credit, of course, to Senator Angus King and Congressman Mike Gallagher, our two co-chairs of the commission. I should have probably started with them and recognizing their efforts. And Mark Montgomery, our executive director, and all of the staff that helped to move us along and shape this report. We could not have done this work without both their leadership and their deep involvement. So I'll stop there and great to take some questions.
Terrific. So I've got a few for both of you, and then of course we're going to open this up to the audience, and they should have instructions about how they're submitting their questions along the way. So Suzanne, let me turn to you on a word that kept coming up in Congressman Langevin conversation, and it's resilience. And it's an interesting phrase because it gets to one of the key issues of deterrence. You can deter by causing a country to pay a price, but you can also deter them by making them think that the attack simply isn't worth it, that your resilience is good enough that you would not accomplish your goal, even if you manage to hack into a system, turn off the lights, affect the markets, whatever it is that the effort was. Can you talk a little bit about that? And of course, what we wouldn't have asked you in Austin, but can now, is what have we learned about national resilience from the first couple of months of dealing with COVID-19, a different kind of threat, but one that gets to some of these same issues of how able the country is to sort of take a hit and then pick up.
Great. Thank you, David. First of all, let me fix something I meant to do at the outset, which is to give those instructions for how to ask questions, because we do look forward to answering your questions, and you can ask them at any time throughout this program by going to the CSIS events page. And many of you are coming in through that events page, but some of you are on YouTube. If you're watching this live, go to the events page, and there should be a button there that says Ask Live Questions Here. Click on that, and you'll be able to type in your question. We'll be collecting those and answering them once David has exhausted his questions, or we let him know that he's taken up too much time.
That's right. They're already pouring in, Suzanne.
Excellent. All right. Well, I'll try to be brief then, so that we have time to answer your very good questions and those from our audience. Yeah, resilience is one of the issues that has always been very near and dear to my heart. I think it's incredibly important, and from my days as the undersecretary at DHS, responsible for what is now known as Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, or CISA. Resilience was a critical part of what we did, and one of the first recommendations in our resilience pillar in the report is to make sure that CISA is fully funded, resourced, and has a clear mission and authorities to do that resilience work. And critical to that is risk assessment and risk management, right? So you can't really be prepared to recover from and minimize the impact of significant cyber incidents unless you've done the analysis to understand what those threats and vulnerabilities are and what consequences they can produce. And then as you look at how do we become resilient against that threat, you look at all the ways in which you can mitigate that impact, those consequences. And the consequences we care about are not just consequences to the IT network, right? It's to the functions that network and those assets and systems enable. And so we looked at that, requiring a multi-year, 5-year risk management cycle in which you do the assessment of your risk and you look at all the ways to mitigate, and then you assess how that mitigation worked and start again. And clarifying CISA's role as the nation's risk manager. Really, that's a key function there. But we also looked at resilience, so that the continuity of the economy that the congressman talked about. But we also talked about elections in that context, because one of the key areas that we've got to focus on now is not, again, in our election security, we're going to do everything we can to prevent malicious cyber activity, for example, but we have to recognize that someone doesn't even have to be successful with regard to malicious cyber activity They can simply claim to have been successful. And if we haven't thought through the ways in which we mitigate the primary harm, which is undermining public trust in the legitimacy of the process of our elections, which goes to that fundamental peaceful transfer of power. Doing that risk assessment helps us to focus in on what is the consequence we care most about. It is undermining that trust. So if we want to mitigate that risk, obviously we're going to try to make sure that we've got our cybersecurity ducks in a row so that we can minimize the likelihood of successful cyber activity. But really, we want to make sure that we've got an audit trail. This is what paper ballots is really all about. Mail-in ballots are by their nature paper ballots. But this is an area in which we need to look at the resilience of that system to protect and preserve public trust in that system. And that also goes to public trust in our institutions generally. So public resilience against pernicious messaging. One of the things that raised questions about the legitimacy of the election in 2016 was obviously disinformation and information operations, some of them cyber enabled. So how do we mitigate that consequence? And so the commission looked at that and made a recommendation for building public resilience, both through media literacy, but really more broadly through civic education and civic engagement. Again, look at the consequence we worry about from disinformation, targeting our institutions, elections, the justice system, which I've been working on for the last several years. It is to get the American public to give up on democracy, to give up on those institutions. And civic education is a way of reminding people about the importance of democracy, what our institutions are all about, what are our aspirations for them, and importantly, how can they be held accountable? How can Americans, how can individuals help hold those institutions accountable, and why they should not disengage, but reinforce their engagement to be informed and engaged citizens to preserve a healthy democracy. COVID has made that even more important, David, because with COVID creating the imperative for looking at how we conduct elections and keep Americans safe, jurisdictions all across the country are making decisions about changes in their election system. Those changes are often being challenged in the courts. If we have allowed declining trust in our institutions, we are going to find that people don't trust the officials who are making these decisions. That's problematic. We will find that people don't trust the courts that are resolving these issues. And we may find ourselves in a situation in which, for example, in November, if we have close elections in races and courts are asked to resolve these disputes, that some segment of the population simply doesn't accept their opinions. And then we're in big trouble. So resilience becomes critically important.
Suzanne, I just want to drill down on one thing that you raised, and it actually matches up with a question we had gotten in, which was about what are the main cyber threats for the election in 2020, and what do you see about any attempts from Russia and other players? So you mentioned the pressure to come up with some different ways to go vote post-COVID. The most obvious one is mail-in ballots, even if you're not absentee. In other words, do the equivalent of an absentee ballot, but when you're in the state. One of the concerns about that goes back to something that happened in the days when you were still at DHS, which was, of course, the Russians got into the registration systems of many of the states. We know about Illinois and Arizona. There was discussion that there may have been in 39 or all 50 of the states, but the number doesn't really make a big difference. What does make a big difference is that your registration system becomes all the more important if what the state is doing is mailing a ballot out to every registered voter. Right? If somebody's gotten into that registration system, you could introduce those doubts that you were just discussing very early on. So tell me, how much are you worried now? How good a job do you think in terms of resilience we have done at hardening the registration systems?
So I think significant progress has been made on hardening the registration systems, but I think your example, David, highlights the importance of getting these things resolved early. Time is such an important aspect here. One of the reasons that corruption of voter registration databases, which is what we were worried about in 2016 when we saw the activity around voter registration databases, is that people show up on election day and are turned away because their name has been removed by a malicious actor or the spelling's been changed or what have you. And there's very little time then, it's election day, for people to remedy that. And one of the things that we are worried about and that we've seen so far, for example, in the Wisconsin primary situation, is when decisions have to be made or are being made at the last minute, there is very little time, insufficient time, to address and deal with the problems that come up. In that case, for example, the fact that ballots were taking too long to get to people and weren't going to get back by election day. The same is true with your example. If someone goes in and alters a voter registration database and removes names, for example, or changes addresses, and people are informed early on that they should be receiving ballots now, right? Or very soon, well in advance of election day, and they don't. If there is time, they can go back to the Secretary of State's office, to their election officials, and say, I should have gotten a ballot. I didn't get one. Why not? So detection is one of the ways in which we can be resilient and address problems. But in this case, it would require time. And that's what I'm very worried about. I'm worried these things are going to take too much time to get resolved and won't be put in place with enough time to address problems that may arise.
Well, thanks. Congressman, I'd like to go back to you on some of the points that you raised early on there as well. And I really wanted to focus the most on the question of how the pandemic has made you think differently about the way we support national security issues that don't immediately fit within an easy military or intelligence budget. So what we've discovered in the pandemic stuff was that we had poured a lot of money into thinking about how you would deal with a bioweapon that was released in the United States, but not anywhere near as much about a naturally occurring one that came out of a wet market or, teenagers at spring break or something like that. In cyber, it strikes me that we have done a huge amount of funding for U.S. Cyber Command and NSA. We don't know exactly how much because some of it is buried in black budgets, but we have a pretty broad sense of that. And yet the report makes clear that since 85% of the targets are in the private sector and so forth, that we are very scattershot in how we've spent money on defenses outside of the government's purview. So pick up a little bit on how your thinking has changed on that issue.
Sure. So there are two things that I would say. The COVID-19 crisis that we find ourselves in has highlighted at least several things, but that are sort of related to cyber. And you think of how important it is to have a coordinated response, a cohesive strategy, and a point person, if you will, helping to bring that all together. And that's one of the reasons why I'm such a big advocate of a national cyber director. It's one of the glaring loopholes we have in terms of somebody being in charge of response and being able to bring together all the elements of both the government response as well as working closely with the private sector. But beyond that, we need to look at continuity of the economy as a major loophole or something that's already left unanswered. And that's why continuity of the economy planning is such an important recommendation in in the findings of the Cyberspace Solarium Commission report. Again, if COVID has shown us anything, it's that preparation and planning are really important in preparing for a catastrophic event. Again, one of the most relevant recommendations, again, is this continuity of economy planning. So this idea that we take stock of our national critical functions and establish a framework that really plans for how to prioritize restarting or recovering core functions in a crisis. So it would identify areas that we should invest in resilience and backup. And for example, what areas do we really need to invest in secure systems or backup like analog because of risk disruption is so catastrophic, or taking those things offline and having them isolated. What are such data so critical to restarting the economy that we should basically explore additional backup systems with allies or trusted partners. So if COVID has taught us anything, is that we need a point person. We need a cohesive, comprehensive strategy and response that needs to be exercised, and it needs to be think about it in terms of how do we, if critical core functions went down in our economy, how do we restart? And so you want to think those things through, just as you're planning them through for response to COVID-19. We also need to think them through in terms of what areas of the country priorities if there ever a cyber incident of significant consequence.
Okay. Suzanne, let me take for you a question that is come in from Mark Friedman of Invariant. He was directing this specifically to you, but others can put in their thoughts as well, Congressman. His question is, in the push to secure that critical infrastructure that both you and the Congressman were talking about, how can the government and industry assure they have visibility into their entire network perimeter and those of their critical suppliers? And how can these organizations maintain accurate asset inventories in the cloud? It's an interesting question because visibility is limited domestically. And then, of course, if the visibility you need is abroad, you can imagine how U.S. Cyber Command or the NSA might have it through their technical means and persistent engagement. But it would be very hard necessarily for the private sector to be able to be out into, say, the land of foreign suppliers and so forth. So what would you say that Mark's question?
Yeah, so the commission did talk about one of the things that we fell back on repeatedly was reaching for the market as a solution whenever we possibly could, with the sense that a market is generally more effective and efficient than the government at bringing about the right kind of behaviors. And yet we understood that the market is failing today. And one of the reasons that the market is failing today is largely failing today, is because of a lack of information. And part of that is information with regard to supply chain, right? That kind of visibility and transparency that you're talking about and that the questioner raises is important if we're going to ask folks to make wiser risk management decisions, right, about how to manage their supply chain. They need information in order to be able to do that. And so the report does talk about that. It talks about the role that the government can play in. We've always, kind of tried to avoid picking winners and losers in the marketplace. But particularly with respect to those national critical functions, there is discussion in the report about the role the government can play in pointing people toward, supply chain visibility, security, and vendors, right? The importance of making sure that we understand our foreign dependencies. And so we've got some recommendations with regard to CFIUS and even broadening that, and the mechanisms within departments and agencies to look at our foreign dependencies, and to move toward, we talked about an industrial strategy with lowercase letters, because that industrial policy can mean so many different things to people. But what we talk about in the report is looking at our foreign dependencies and making sure that we have secure and reliable supply chains. And again, a number of areas in which we recommend that the government provide more information to the public, and require, in some instances, more information from the private sector. And particularly that is true with regard to what the Congressman referred to as SICI, systemically important critical infrastructure, which I think we all agree is a rather unfortunate acronym, but we put it in
just
the
one
report.
of many in the cyber world. Yes.
This, this notion that there are elements of our critical infrastructure that are particularly systemically important for sustaining these national critical functions, and that relationship needs to be a two-way relationship. So they might have a privileged, if you will, relationship, for example, with the intelligence community, but they might also be required to provide information to the government.
Okay. Congressman, we had a question from my friend Harvey Richkoff of the American Bar Association, who says many thanks for the good work for both of you. And he asked, what is the best way to establish international norms in cyber, in your view, given the state of the UNGGE, another one of those awful acronyms and all this, but it's the UN group of experts who have dealt with this stuff. Let me piggyback on Harvey's question and see if I can make it harder, which is to say that if we're going to have international norms, which is to say, we all agreed that we won't mess with each other's power systems, or we won't mess with each other's emergency medical response, or we won't mess with each other's water systems or something like that, or election systems. I think you'd probably get a few Americans to sign up for that.
Yeah.
That means that the U.S. intelligence community, NSA, Cyber Command, would have to basically say what they were willing to give up. Because all of our plans involve, if you got into a conflict, being inside the infrastructure of another country. So I'd like you to answer Harvey's question, which is, what's the best way to establish norms, but also whether your experience on the commission led you to believe that anybody in the intelligence community or the defense community is actually willing to say, okay, we are willing to deny ourselves of X targets or tools in order to make those international norms work.
So let's draw the distinction here between intelligence gathering and understanding information and having situation awareness from actions that would be deemed as something that's offensive in peacetime. Yeah, I'm not naive to think that governments are all going to suddenly stop intelligence collection activities. It's understanding the world around us that actually makes us safer, right? I mean, if you have perfect fidelity and understanding of your enemies or adversaries' actions, and you know whether they are peaceful or malign, you can adjust your behavior. It's when fear kicks in, when you don't know what those intentions are, that consequences can escalate and negative things can happen, spin out of control really quickly. So I'm not suggesting that governments are going to stop intelligence gathering and being out there. What I am saying though is that we can agree to international norms that we're not going to attack each other's critical infrastructure or critical functions in peacetime, and therefore we need to look in time of war, time of conflict. We all recognize that the gloves come off, and that the country, the United States, would always do whatever is necessary to protect the American people. So that calculus is not going to change either in anything in this report or anything going forward. But what we can say is that we expect responsible actions and behavior in cyberspace. And when those norms are violated, we as an international community need to be able to come together quickly, call out bad behavior, and impose consequences certainly at a time and place of our choosing. But it doesn't necessarily have to be an offensive cyber action. It could be a sanction. It could be indictments or what have you. But being able to act with agility, act quickly and responsibly when you have enough information to call out a bad actor is important. And although this is not cyber related, I'll look at the Skripal poisoning that happened in Great Britain. And there's a situation where we didn't have perfect information about who perpetrated that activity, but the international community, using all source intelligence and collaboration, came together very quickly and said, the Russians did that. That's irresponsible. That is not action that we are going to tolerate on our soil. And the international community collectively called the Russians and responded with sanctions. We need to have that same type of mindset when we're talking about malign cyber activity in cyberspace.
David, I would just add, Congressman's of course exactly right. That despite the skepticism reflected in your question about whether the military and IC would ever agree to, sort of unilaterally disarm, if you will, that we were leading. I mean, when I was at DHS, the administration was leading the global effort to try to get agreement around these norms, one of which, as the Congressman said, was not attacking critical infrastructure upon which populations depend. And these were peacetime norms, right? And that was a really important distinction. But that was an administration position, that I think I can say the IC and the military, we had lots of interagency discussions about this, and the agreement was, yes, we can support this, pushing for these norms. So I think that's important to recognize.
But we haven't that much, and not only during the Obama administration, there was an initial agreement at the UN that fell apart later on, in part because of Chinese and Russian disagreements. And during the Trump administration, when there were even vague sort of standards that were put out by President Macron during the 100th anniversary of the end of World War I, we saw a number of countries and a lot of companies sign up to them, but the two democracies that did not were the United States and India.
Yep. Well, it requires, the right direction from the White House.
Congressman, one of the questions that has come in has been on a specific threat, which is North Korea, which you looked at. This comes from Connie Kim, Voice of America, who asked how much of a threat you see from North Korea, even though its capability is not as great as China's or Russia's, and how is Congress of the U.S. planning to counter or deter North Korea's cyber threats? As I look at what's happened in the past couple of years, it's interesting how innovative the North Koreans have been. Just as a symbol of what a small power that doesn't have a lot of money to spend, but is highly motivated, can go do. And we've seen their entries into manipulating the cyber currency markets. We've seen their ability to fake out the international banking system and get into the SWIFT system as well, and steal a fair bit of money that way. As I know that when you had your commission sessions, in some cases you were country specific. The report doesn't tend to be very much, but talk a little bit about what we've learned from the North Korea experience.
So it goes back to what I've said many times, that we'll never again see modern warfare or conflict or these types of operations that happen in the future without some type of a cyber component. And our two oceans used to give us a great security, if you will, because of the distance between us and our enemies or adversaries. That has now forever changed, and it's just as easy to attack someone, if you will, or carry out an operation from someone in the next room as it is to do it half a world away. And when you're talking about certainly nation state capabilities, they are significant. And certainly North Korea has invested heavily in disruptive and malign and offensive cyber capabilities, and as have Russia, China, Iran, as well as other nations. But those are the kind of the top four that give me the most concern. And of course, not only developing these tools that could be used against us to harm us, but also they working with proxies, that they could work with proxies to carry out some type of offensive cyber operation. So look, we need to, and we talked about this basically in the Solarium report, but being able to use all assets of national power to deter or respond to malign cyber activities. And look, it sometimes it might be cyber on cyber, but it also could be indictments. It could be sanctions, and that's why this is again one of the key findings of the report, calling for more involvement and cooperation with international partners, the international community, to promote responsible state behavior in cyberspace. That's why it's so important that we create an assistant secretary of state for cyber, and lead a new division, if you will, this Bureau of Cyberspace Security and Emerging Technologies. And this would eliminate the reversal of the elimination of the position held by Chris Painter, who was the top cyber diplomat at state before. By doing these things, that's how we work collaboratively, and we promote responsible state behavior in cyberspace, and punish bad actors when they don't act responsibly.
Suzanne, you've heard the congressman twice talk about non-cyber responses to cyber events. He mentioned indictments, which the U.S. has done against Russia, China, Iran, and North Korean actors. He mentioned sanctions, which we've done in the cyber arena against North Korea, Iran, and Russia. And yet, I think there is a sense right now, and correct me if I'm wrong, that while these were designed to improve deterrence, that we don't have much of a scorecard to show as a result. That, after those Russian indictments, the Russians have come back. After the North Korean indictments, the North Koreans have continued to mess in in cryptocurrency areas and other territory. This all gets to your debate about how you deal with gray zone action. So did your thinking on this change any over your time serving on the Solarium Commission?
So, we talked a lot about the fact that deterrence is not working below what, sort of whatever you think that threshold is for kind of use of force. But in this sort of gray zone, deterrence seems not to be working. And a big part of that is, as we started our discussions, the sense was that a big part of that is that the adversary is not feeling any consequences. And so big emphasis on imposing consequences. Had a lot of discussion about that. One of the and there's a fair amount of that, and I'll come back to it in the report. But one of the things that I thought was interesting, both in the evolution of my thinking on this, but I saw it more broadly, the members of the commission. The commission, of course, was a creature of the National Defense Authorization Act and the Senate Armed Services Committee. I think it's fair to say, and Congressman, you can disagree if you saw it differently, but I think it's fair to say that we started out with a very much of a look at the adversary. How can we think about imposing consequences? We need to deter cyber activity, punch the bad guy in the nose. And a number of our first few meetings was all focused on that. Over time, I think there was an increased appreciation for a recognition of the need to move beyond just consequences and really focus on protecting the ecosystem and on resilience, because our ability to deter the actor by simply raising the costs, i.e. imposing consequences, is limited. So let's start with that. I think it is easier to think about imposing consequences that might limit the appeal for private individuals, proxies, to continue to work with states. And I think that is really the primary advantage of the law enforcement approach, is potentially limiting the ability, for example, of those private actors, cyber criminals, who might loan their services out to states to get to their villa in the south of France, for example. And so we do talk about strengthening the ability of the FBI to use its tools. But there is a limit to the degree to which we can impose consequences. We think that it's important to think about deterrence, however, not in the traditional terms of nuclear deterrence, where you have a binary situation. You've either deterred your adversary from using a nuclear weapon or you haven't. And that's pretty stark. It's pretty obvious to see. In cyber, of course, what we're talking about is something that we know is going to continue to go on, but where you look to reduce the level of activity or the severity of that activity. And that's the kind of deterrence that we're talking about. And one of the most important things that we highlight, and David, your questions have gotten to this as well, is that in order to have an effective deterrent strategy, you have to look at individual actors. There's not going to be a comprehensive strategy that's going to deter them all. North Korea is driven by different motivations and can be leveraged in different ways than Russia or China. So one of the things that we call for in there is a much more robust campaign planning process for developing country-specific strategies for deterring malicious behavior in cyberspace. And I think we have to be realistic that, part of what we're trying to do is to get them to move off of some things. They're going to continue, as with China. We got China for some period of time to reduce its activity in cyberspace, to steal sensitive business information to help its companies. But their activity to steal sensitive business information in non-cyber ways was not reduced at all. And so we need to understand.
And now they're back.
Now they're back in cyber.
If you believe what you read in the New York Times, they're back and looking at vaccines.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And they're listen, so that goes again to understand their motivations. They are going to do what they think they need to do, first and foremost, to stay in power. And we need to be realistic about that. And then we need to look at, okay, how do we keep them out of the things that would harm us the most?
And so that's why, if I could jump in here, David, and say, we need to ensure that we are raising our cyber defenses, strengthening our cyber defenses, so that we are ostensibly then imposing costs on our adversaries by they're spending all this time, effort, and resources trying to get into or carry out whatever malign cyber activity that they're looking to carry out, but they're getting little to no benefit out of it. So squandering resources on their part, getting little or nothing in return for it. And so strengthening our defenses has to be a key going forward. Again, right now, we're the country that makes most use of the internet, but we're also most subject to its vulnerabilities. We want to kind of narrow that window, if you will, and that gap between what adversaries are doing right now and getting out of it, and how we strengthen our defenses so that we are stronger going forward.
Congressman, let me just pick up with you on one last question, because I see we're just down to the last few minutes of this. So there are a lot of congressional commissions over the years, and presidential commissions, and some of them turn out to be effective and bring about big changes. I would say the 9/11 Commission certainly brought about major changes. You can argue about which ones of those were effective or not, but there certainly were. I can name some other commissions and won't, where the report sort of got filed away. You've tried a different strategy here, which is to operationalize the report with very specific recommendations of things to go move into legislation, much of it into the NDAA, the Defense Authorization Act, because you know the president's going to sign the NDAA. It's a question of what you can actually get into it before he signs it, right? But my question to you is, first of all, given Congress's somewhat shortened attention span in the midst of COVID and the economic recovery and all that, how does that impact your strategy? And secondly, Suzanne wisely, because everything Suzanne says I find is pretty wise, makes the distinction that you should not use the nuclear analogies here for deterrence, something you and I have been talking about for many years. And yet I find among your colleagues, it's the first thing out of their mouth when you ask a question for somebody who was not served on the Solarium Commission, who has not thought about these issues much. So how effective do you think the Solarium has been at educating the rest of your colleagues in Congress?
So I think it has definitely raised the bar, and it has definitely helped to educate more members. But remember, there are 435 members of the House, 100 members of the Senate, and each have their own areas of interest and priority. My job has been I focused on cyber for more than a decade now, to try to raise the level of awareness and expertise and interest in cyber for colleagues and staff. And we've succeeded to some degree, but unfortunately, I think the main reason for the enhanced awareness of cyber vulnerabilities is because of the many threats that we face, the high-profile hacks and intrusions that have occurred. So the awareness level is high right now. I think that the Solarium has helped to better educate members, and I hope more do the deep dive. But we're going to be holding congressional hearings. There's already been a hearing that's happened in the Senate. We're going to be doing ours, even if it's virtually, on the House side. Very pleased. Again, we have 4 members of Congress who are deeply committed to seeing these cyber recommendations enacted. Maybe some over the short, medium, and the long term. But I'm looking for ways to see as many of them enacted as possible. If my experience in Congress and my experience at the Kennedy School at Harvard taught me nothing, it's that is making a good public policy has 3 elements, as I've often said, which is you have a problem, you have a solution, and a window of opportunity. And those 3 don't often line up easily or quickly, but when they do, you need to be able to push your initiative across the finish line. And we are using, of course, the vehicle of the NDAA to enact some of those proposals. As you pointed out, it's very likely that will be signed into law before the end of the year. It's 51 or 52 years running now that the NDAA has been enacted. So I have high confidence that we're going to meet with success for some of these things, and others will move through in other ways. But by the way, the COVID-19 crisis, unfortunately, has provided a window of opportunity that we need to learn from, and that we will use this time to do things like hopefully push through things like IT modernization. So one of the things that you see is a problem for states, municipalities. They have antiquated IT infrastructure. And so incentivizing and supporting funds and encouraging states to modernize their IT infrastructure and moving to the cloud so that they can handle both surging to accommodate the need for enhanced services. For example, you've seen and heard the stories about unemployment insurance, where people have not been able to get online, haven't been able to get their UI in a timely manner. It's because states can't handle that level of onslaught of applications coming in. But if states had their their data in the cloud and their systems in the cloud and could easily ramp up. They could easily handle a surge in need and response that they need to have to accommodate citizens' requests for support. So these are the types of, and by the way, it enhances security, right? If we want to encourage data moved to the cloud, IT modernization, but we also need to have a certification process to know that the cloud infrastructure is secure, and that's going to be on the part of the cloud infrastructure providers to make sure that they're making extra effort to secure their cloud infrastructure. But we have great proposals here, and I think a window of opportunity to push through many of them, and collectively we're going to do our best. I know that the commissioners are committed to that, the members of Congress are committed to that, and I see real prospects for success in the near future.
Well, Suzanne, we are not out of questions, but we are out of time, I'm afraid. So I'm going to turn this back to you for your any closing comments, and spare you guys having to sit through my efforts to learn how to be a drummer. And thank you both for such a great conversation.
David, thank you for terrific moderating there. Nothing moderate about David except his wonderful moderating skills. And Congressman, thank you. And I want to echo your thanks to our wonderful bipartisan, really nonpartisan leadership of Senator Angus King and Congressman Mike Gallagher, and our outstanding staff at the commission. And I will just close by saying that I really look forward to the time when the three of us can get together for some Texas barbecue, even if we have to do it in Washington, D.C. I want to thank everyone who joined us for this discussion, and take care and stay safe.